Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Making Lemonade, the Paradox Between Bitter and Sweet. You will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them into the questions pane. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to now introduce today's presenter, Darcy Thiel. Darcy is a licensed mental health counselor in New York State. She earned her master's degree in clinical psychology from Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Darcy is a couple and family therapist in West Seneca and participated in our Engaging Patients and End-of-Life Conversations conference as a panel speaker and role play, writer, and actor. Darcy?
Good morning. Thanks, Tara. So as Tara said, I am a licensed mental health counselor and have been doing counseling in West Seneca area for the last 20 years. And as of 2013, I also opened a publishing company and wrote 2 books. One is Bitter and Sweet, A Family's Journey with Cancer. The second is Life After Death, On This Side of Heaven. And that is what is bringing me here to you today. I would like you to watch a video that will make this a whole lot more personal so that you can meet my family.
Work, school, home. I did my engineering work, study.
So that's my family. And I think that for those of us that work in the mental health profession or the medical profession, one of the things that we need to really strive to do is to keep things personal. I think a lot of times we're kind of instructed to detach from our clients and our patients, and I think that making sure that we maintain that human connection is really important in meeting the needs of the people that we work with. So that was a very brief synopsis of our story. My husband, Tim, in May of 2010, was diagnosed with gallstones and scheduled for a very simple outpatient gallbladder removal procedure. And when the surgeon went inside, discovered that things were not as they were supposed to be. And a few days later, he was diagnosed with stage 4 gallbladder cancer. Gallbladder cancer is a particularly rare form of cancer, and one of its hallmarks is that there aren't any symptoms until your very late stages. Tim used to say he had a particularly clever cancer, as it did hide itself until he was stage 4. And the problem with that is twofold. One is because it's rare, there's very little research that goes into that particular type of cancer. And number two, it's very difficult to treat. It really doesn't give you much of a fighting chance. So our lives were turned upside down very, very quickly. While we were still working and homeowners and parents, we were also thrust into an entirely different world of hospitals and tests and having to become educated about a disease that we had known nothing about. It was during that first month that several people had approached me about Caring Bridge, which was a website where you could blog and journal about your experience. And I had never heard of Caring Bridge, and at the time I was so overwhelmed with everything else, I thought there was no way I could handle researching something else. But enough people were insistent on it, and I'm super glad that we did decide to open up a site on there, because it really changed the course of everything that happened for us. So caringbridge.org is a very, very useful resource for anyone that is going through any sort of medical crisis. It's set up like a blog, and you can update people and give them kind of a blow-by-blow writing of what's going on. And so what Tim and I did was educate our friends and family and loved ones about the disease as we were becoming educated, but we also wrote a lot about what our lives were like on a personal basis and how our lives were affected day to day and how we were coping with what was going on. And that is how the birth of the books came into being, because people started telling us, you guys really should make this into a book because we can relate to what's going on, we understand what's happening, and we know how to help. So I kind of tucked that in the back of my head, and eventually, a couple of years after Tim had passed away, I started thinking about that and revisited the idea of putting our journals into a book form. I call the books our lemonade now, because I think life can hand you some lemons, and being 48 years old and handed a diagnosis and having 5 months to deal with that diagnosis is certainly a batch of lemons. But I think that the book has been the books have become a way that we have used something that was very difficult to change our lives and to help other people. So when I started writing, it became obvious to me that the name of the book had to be Bitter and Sweet, because that 5 months that we had, you can imagine, was the worst 5 months of our lives. But I can honestly say, and Tim could honestly say to you, that it was also the best 5 months of our lives. I think a lot of the work that we do here with the P2 Collaborative is about trying to make death and dying and the subject of advanced care planning and all of those topics less taboo in our culture. I think that some amazing things can happen if you are willing to look at this topic and to accept the concept of mortality in a very real way. For us, that was a process. The whole concept of the paradox of a terminal illness, I think, is a pretty strong image of one of the most difficult things we can face in our lives. And that is somehow being able to fight a disease and to have an attitude of compliance and positive outlook, along with accepting your mortality at the same time. It's pretty impossible, and yet I think it's what you're asked to do when you have a terminal illness. And if there is a way to do death well, I think that my husband and my family achieved that. So let's go back to May when we got our original diagnosis. One of the fortunate pieces with gallbladder cancer was that it wasn't a particularly painful cancer. Tim was uncomfortable with eating and had some pain on occasion, but for the most part, he was able to function pretty normally. He was a very hard worker. He was a mechanical engineer, and he worked for a super great company that did everything they possibly could to make this as easy of a transition as possible. And he was able to work almost full-time through most of that 5 months. In fact, he worked up until 2 weeks before he died. That was pretty amazing for him. And it's kind of funny because before this kind of thing hits your family, I used to hear about people with diagnoses, and I think, why don't they just quit work and open up a whole bunch of credit cards and travel the world and do whatever they want? Because I think that's what I would do. But then this really weird thing happens. When that's a reality in your life, the thing that you crave more than anything is being normal. It's just not what you think it's going to be at all. More than anything, Tim wanted to go to work and provide for his family like he had always done. That was just something that he valued. And we did talk a lot about bucket lists, and he wanted to go. There were some shots in that video that you saw of Williamsburg, Virginia, and I used to tease him about that because I was like, come on, what kind of bucket list do we have? Can we, like, cruise, an African safari, something really exciting? But we went to Williamsburg, Virginia, which was great. It was a wonderful vacation, but that was one of the last things we were able to do together as a family. So I think also as medical professionals and people in this industry, I think that, you know, we see people in appointments and really have very little idea about what their lives are like on a daily basis. And our lives were definitely turned upside down. On a daily basis, we were dealing with school and work and handling different things, but we also had to do things to prepare. Now, we were told at the beginning of Tim's treatment that the prognosis for his particular cancer was 1 to 2 years, which sounded incredibly short. Yet we had no idea that we were only going to have 5 months, which when you're looking at 5 months, 1 to 2 years, would have seemed like a very long time. But we were operating under the assumption that we would have 1 to 2 years. How his chemo worked was he would have certain number of weeks, 9 weeks of treatment, and then they would do tests to see where he was at, and then continue another 9 weeks, do tests, et cetera, et cetera. And when chemo 1 regimen stopped working, we would then switch to chemo 2. So that was the plan. So things kind of rolled along. Tim would go for his treatments and take his medicines, and if you've ever been to Roswell or been through this kind of treatment, you know the first thing that you do is get your blood drawn when you walk in. Then by the time you get up to your clinic, they usually have your blood test results, so they know exactly what they're dealing with when they talk about the next part of treatment. So with Tim's cancer, we were looking at a particular cancer marker in his blood test results. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know we started out somewhere around 40,000. And every time he would go in, the number would drop. When we were looking at the 9-week marker, I think it had dropped to somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000. So it was a very significant drop, which was great news. And we fully expected that treatment was going very well. His first 9-week mark, and I can tell you when it was because it was my son's 8th birthday. The little cute blonde kid in the video, that was our 7-year-old son, and he was having his 8th birthday in August, and his birthday was on a Sunday, and we had gone in for Tim's test the week before. So on Friday of that week, I got a call from Tim's oncologist, and she said to me, and this is a quote because it's one I'll never forget, "This is contradictory data we can't explain." So in spite of all of the markers along the way that had indicated things were going well, the cancer had spread everywhere in Tim's body. The chemo had not worked at all. And this was pretty shocking to the doctors and to us. And Tim was at work. He had put in a full week of work, full-time work, and he came home Friday, and I had the task of telling him about his test results. So that part where I said you need to fight and be positive and upbeat became a huge reality for us, because in hindsight, looking back, I think what happened on that weekend was that Tim's spirits were crushed and he gave up hope. And while he worked a full-time week, by Sunday on David's birthday, he was almost non-responsive. We were able to get a few people to help him outside so that he could be there when we cut David's birthday cake. But other than that, he had stopped eating and really did not seem to have any quality of life. By Monday morning, we took him into Roswell, and his treatment team was very shocked to see him because he had just been in and was his usual chipper self. And we weren't sure what was going on. They ran some tests and thought possibly a bowel obstruction, but they weren't sure what was going on, so he was admitted to the hospital. I was told at that time that we were looking at the next 24 hours as critical. He would either pull through or it might be it. And I tell the story about that weekend because I think it really illustrates the roller coaster that people live on when they're dealing with a terminal illness. So I'm going to keep repeating myself. Full-time work, normal day at work on Friday. On Monday, we're told he may have 24 hours to live. That was crazy. Now, we had to make some decisions at that time as well because we now knew that chemo 1 wasn't working. It made no sense to continue chemo 1, so we had to make a decision about chemo 2. Our oncologist was very honest with us and told us that chemo 2 was a lot more toxic, meaning the quality of life Tim had been enjoying would have decreased immensely. But the important question was, would chemo 2 work? Would it be effective? And again, we were told based on Tim's history and responses to that point, it would be highly unlikely that chemo 2 would be effective. At the same time, we were also educating ourselves with some articles we had been given about palliative care, specifically hospice in our case. And one of the things that was fascinating that they find in the research is that people actually live longer many times when they switch to palliative care than if they stay in treatment. That was mind-boggling to us, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense. When you strip away all of our medical knowledge and all of our science and all of that exciting stuff, human beings basically need food and sleep. And when you're in treatment, neither of those things are very available to you. When you're kept comfortable with comfort care, food and sleep come back to you. So it makes a whole lot of sense that you actually can live a longer and higher quality life with palliative care. So we made the very difficult decision at that point to switch to palliative care versus curative care. Now, this was on a Monday when Tim was admitted to the hospital, and on Tuesday, my sister came into town and insisted that I go home. I pretty much had stayed with Tim throughout the hospital stay, and she thought it would be a good idea for me to go home and sleep in my own bed for a night, and so I reluctantly agreed and went home Tuesday and stayed in my bed and woke up Wednesday and getting ready to go back to the hospital. Before I could leave, the phone rang, and I answered the phone, and it was my husband, who just said ever so casually that he needed to mow the lawn when he got home. And I was a little in shock because when I left, he wasn't responding. So this has kind of become a big family joke in my house. My sister and he were sworn to secrecy with each other. I have no idea what happened after I left, but I left my husband in a bed not talking with my sister, and when I arrived back at the hospital Wednesday morning, there he was sitting up in a chair reading the paper with a fully eaten breakfast tray in front of him. And what would you think my response would be? You would guess overjoyed, but instead I started crying. I told him that I thought that I would end up dying before he would because this whole process was killing me. And we had a good laugh and a good cry about all of that. And remember that roller coaster I started to tell you about? Work of full-time work week, of full-time, I'm stuttering. A full-time work week on Friday. Monday told he might not have more than 24 hours to live. And by that Friday, he went back to work. That is the roller coaster that we lived on. It was a very, very changeable, flexible, gut-wrenching time for us. Things were very, very out of our control to a large extent, and we had to learn to just go with it. The next month and a half with palliative care brought in the era of steroids. And if you know anything about steroids, they are an amazing miracle drug, but what they do is cure symptoms, not the disease. Now, our family was very familiar with steroids because a couple of months earlier, our very, very loved pet cat, Oreo, was diagnosed with cancer as well. And we put him on steroids, and we had a lovely month with him when you would have no idea that he even had cancer. And then one morning, he just woke up, and we knew it was time. And I can guarantee there was not anyone in our house that didn't understand the irony of what was happening, because his life was parallel with Tim's. And the last physical job Tim was able to do in our house was digging the cat's grave for us in the yard. So hospice did a super great job educating us about steroids, and they told us that Tim was going to feel and look much better, but that we needed to not be fooled by the effects of steroids, because we were going to think that Tim was getting better, that maybe even his cancer condition was improving. But we needed to understand that that was not the case, that Tim was in the stages of dying. That was really important information because it was exactly that. I remember going to Tim's job one day and his coworkers pulling me aside to talk to me. And they said, listen, we're confused. We're reading your Bridge entries every day. We understand what you're saying, but we're working here with him every day. He's still eating a plate full of muffins on Fridays. He's still taking the stairs 2 at a time. This just doesn't make sense to us. And I said to them exactly what hospice explained to me, that that is the effect of steroids, and you need to not be fooled by them. Be grateful for the results of them, but that Tim indeed is in active stages of dying. The other thing you might know about steroids is that they also can cause you to be extremely emotional. So we had a lot of fun with Tim during this time. I'll be dating ourselves, but David at the time watched the Disney Channel, and Hannah Montana was the big show that we watched. And if you have little kids, you know there's those times when you and your spouse are watching TV and you realize your child is in bed and you're still watching the Disney Channel. That would happen to us all the time. But Tim would watch Hannah Montana and cry because he would get so emotional about the episode, and we'd be like, oh my God, Tim, are you watching Hannah Montana again? And he'd be like, yeah, it was the greatest episode, you should have seen what happened. So he was a very emotional guy during the steroid phase as well, but he had a great sense of humor, and he just went with all of that, joking and prodding and all of that. So the last week of his life, he spent in hospice. That was not his wish. He wanted to die at home like most people do. But his sleep had gotten off its cycle, and he was very sleep deprived, as was I. And so we had admitted him in hopes that his sleep cycle would get back on track and he could come home. So what happens when you're sleep deprived, and what happens when you have progressed cancer, is that you can become very delirious, and Tim's safety became an issue with us at home. We were told to hide all of his medications because he could accidentally take them several times and not remember that he had taken them. At one point when I was home with him, I was on the computer and I heard him yell, and he had gone outside when I didn't realize it and was trying to start the lawnmower and fell. And other things would happen during the middle of the night where I would wake up and he would be standing on a ladder changing batteries on the smoke detector, or he would be standing in front of the ice dispenser at the refrigerator and just watching ice pour all over the floor, because he was just not always in reality. And I was equally, well, probably not equally, but I was also sleep deprived as well. So I was getting kind of loopy myself. And we made the difficult decision for Tim to go into hospice for, in hopes of getting his sleep cycle back on track. He really was the guy with a sense of humor, and while he maintained his positive attitude and his strong belief that he was going to make it and shatter all the statistics for his disease, he also worked hard to get his affairs in order. And when you're willing to have that conversation, lots of great things can happen. For instance, you can design your own headstone. for the cemetery, which he did. You can make wedding cards for your 3 sons that weren't married. In fact, can we show that picture? Here's our family just a couple of years ago. Andrew got married a couple of years ago, and he kept saying to me for the year he was engaged, I'm excited about getting married, but I know my dad left me a card, and I'm almost as excited about getting that card as I am about getting married. That was a pretty great day for him. David is now 14, but he gets a birthday card from his dad every year. Tim made cards for him until he's 18 years old. Those are really precious gifts and not ones that he could have left had he refused to accept the fact that he is a mortal being. Other things can happen, like you can plan a lot of your funeral service and pick your songs and pick out your readings. You can pick out the clothes you're going to wear. That's also very helpful for the people that get left behind because it stops an awful lot of confusion and arguments afterwards. My poor father, when he walked into the funeral home and saw Tim in his t-shirt and jeans and Sabres hat, he was mortified because he should have had a suit on. But I was able to say, Dad, Tim picked out his clothes. And he said, oh, okay. Tim really did have a great sense of humor, and we had that conversation when he was in hospice. And I asked him, I said, you know, we didn't talk about what you wanted to wear. And his response to me, after thinking for a moment, was that he wanted to wear a hat. That was it. And I said, you know, I've been a really good sport with all of your stuff, but I refuse to bury you naked, so you better come up with some clothes ideas. And so he did. Another thing he did was pick out his cemetery plot. That was a fun day. We had picked out the cemetery and went to meet with the caretaker, and he brought us to a piece of land and showed us the ones that were available. And the next thing I knew, Tim was laying on the ground with his hands back over his head, and I said, pray tell, what are you doing? And he said, well, I think that if I'm going to spend eternity here, I ought to see if I liked it. And I said, well, okay, what do you think? And he said, it's pretty nice here. I'm good with this. And I looked at the caretaker, who assured me he had seen much crazier things than that. And we got up to walk to the car, and then Tim said to me, hey, I need you to promise me something. You know, so I'm expecting, you know, some take care of my children or, you know, some important thing. And he says to me, could you put in my casket a word find book and a pencil? And I'm like, well, of course I can. Would you like to explain that one? And he said, well, what if I wake up? I'm going to be bored. And I said, okay, you think a word find book and pencil will help with that? And he said, oh, it'll be dark. I don't think I should light a match. And I said, good thinking, probably not a good idea. So in Tim's casket went a word find book, a pencil, and a flashlight. And you know what? That became one of my most favorite things, because you know how that goes at a funeral home. You have the casket, and then you have the family lined up, and then you have the literally 400 people that came to the funeral home that night and the line that went out the door. And they come and they see you, and you're the widow, and they hug you and they cry, and it's so sad. But I would hug a person and I would cry with them, and then I'd wait for it, because I'd walk over to the casket and I had put a note in there explaining why those things were in there. And then I would hear the person laugh and chuckle. And that's the epitome of bitter and sweet. That was what our lives were about. the happy and the sad, the glass half full, the glass half empty. The paradox of accepting your mortality, your death, your leaving, with embracing life and trying to fight and loving those around you every moment. That's the message of both of my books, the message that I think Tim came to in his life because of his diagnosis, and the message that we try to still give in lectures and in talks and in webinars and other such events. Do we have questions?